The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When the Pharisees, with some of the scribes who have come from Jerusalem, gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and the scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" He responded, "Well, did Isaiah prophesy about the hypocrites as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. You disregard God's commandments, but cling to human traditions." He summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come from the within are what defile. From within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
My brothers and sisters in Christ, who are the Pharisees? Christ runs into them practically everywhere he goes. And throughout the years, we've heard the term Pharisee many, many, many times. And we really don't know who they are. So today I'm going to take a little time to explain to you who the Pharisees are and why there is such a tremendous clash of differences between the doctrine of Christ and the law. Part of the problem is that the Pharisees, first of all, come into existence sort of later on. They're not part of the original law of the time of Moses. They come into existence around the year 150 BC, somewhere around that time. They are self-appointed moral theologians, if you might want to use that term, or self-appointed lawyers, in a modern phrase. But they really aren't lawyers to the sense of defending and prosecuting and so on and so on. They are self-interpreters of the law. The word Pharisee, which is a Hebrew word which means separated ones, they had separated themselves from any political connections. They wanted nothing to do with the Romans. They even disconnected themselves from Herod, who, by the way, Herod the Great was half Jewish. And a lot of people don't know that, but you study a little bit of history. Herod was raised in Palestine. He was raised in a Jewish family. He was Jewish. For his higher education, he went to Rome. And there he became good friends with the emperor's son. And the emperor passed away, and the son became the emperor. So Herod was appointed a fiefdom in Palestine. Since he knew the people, he was half Jewish. At least by the time he gets back to Palestine, he was Jewish originally. But now he becomes a pagan. The Jewish people didn't want anything to do with King Herod. The Pharisees certainly didn't want anything to do with him at all. They kept a distance from them. But part of the problem is they also separated themselves from the people of the land. the mass of the people who did not know the law. Now, you know, in this time period, most people can't read or write. So they count on being instructed and taught by the rabbis, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. And they expect that what they're being taught is what God has revealed. But in the end, it's not true. Nowhere did God in the Old Law, in the Old Testament, ever tell the Jewish people, make sure to scrub the skin off your hands before you eat. Wash your hands. Didn't say any of that. It was the way that they interpreted things. And they had piled things on top of the law and more and more and more and more. It became difficult to even understand anymore what was the original law of God and what was added to it. And it made it hard for the average person to follow the law. By the time Christ comes into the world, there are 6,000 of these Pharisees. They come from the middle class. They've added precept after precept after precept. 613 precepts were to be lived by every Jew according to their teaching. Nobody really knew anymore what was the actual law that God had revealed. The problem is now they've made these precepts more important than what God had wanted, which made it next to impossible for a human being who couldn't read or write to remember all these things. Can you imagine living by 613 precepts every day? We have a hard time. Remember, we have to go to church on Sunday, or to go to confession once a year, and maybe a couple of other things. Just imagine for a moment if you had to remember all the teachings, all the canon laws, and all those things. Life would be unbearable. God does expect us certainly to live the basics and to know the basics. But if you go to the Holy Land today, and I took a semester in Jerusalem, and I remember being in a hotel and being on the elevator on a Sabbath. It was a Saturday. And a Jewish rabbi came in to the elevator, and he stood there, and I stood there. And I was waiting for him to push the button. He wouldn't do it. They had put a voice box into the elevator. And he said something in Hebrew. And the elevator took off. He was going to the 10th floor, the same floor I was going to. And I asked our instructor in class the next day, I said, what exactly happened here? They believed that pushing an elevator button was offensive to God. It was called work on the Sabbath. They couldn't do it. How extreme can you be? How stupid can you be? This is where they carried the law of God to make it unbearable for the human being to carry out. That even 2,000 years later, you can't push an elevator button on a Saturday because it's considered offensive to God. And this is why Jesus is always running into them. There's always a contradiction. And again, he calls them hypocrites. You with two faces. You show one side, but you live another. In other words, you don't live the law, but you expect everybody else to do it. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. And this is what frustrated Christ in the end. They made these human doctrines more important than the law of God itself. And this is why they're always clashing. But the other part of the aspect here is Christ came into the world to teach something different to men. You see, a good Jew believed that he was saved by living the law. If he lived the law perfectly, he was saved to the best of his ability. There was nothing interior, there was nothing inside that needed to change. He didn't need to become a better person. He didn't need to be gentle or kind or generous or so on and so on. As long as he fulfilled the law, he was saved. Christ now came into the world to say, no, it's not the law that saves. It's not the external element of doing things that saves the human being. What saves the human being is the interior movement of the human being towards God. And this is something they just couldn't understand because it was so far and so different from everything they were used to. They could think bad about their neighbor. They could cheat their neighbor in their minds. They could do whatever, as long as they didn't break the law. But Christ was teaching something new. He was teaching something different. Christianity was to be an interior expression, first and foremost. That when we go to church, Sundays or Saturdays or whenever we go to church, we're there because we want to be close to God, we want to love God, we want to be near God, we want to know God, we want to experience God in the depth of our souls. You see, the Jews couldn't do that. No matter how well they lived the law, they could have no interior experience in their soul of the living God. All they had was the law. And they believed, of course, if they lived the law, not only were they saved, but that God was on their side. It didn't matter what their thoughts said, as long as the law was in place. So there was a complete contradiction in the mystery of the revelation from the old to the new. And I have no doubt that the apostles probably struggled a little bit with this as well, because they were Jewish. They lived by the law. What Christ was teaching them, he also lived by the law. But he lived by God's law. He didn't live by these stupid human precepts. Now, what's interesting about all of that, in the 2nd century A.D., 100 and some years after our Lord is crucified and died, resurrected and in heaven, all the experts, about 100 of them in the Jewish law, got together and they decided they needed to reinterpret and interpret the way a good Jew lives the law. There were some things they had to kick out and some things they had to add and so on and so on, and things just became more and more complex. They came up with a book that was about that thick. You can see it in Jerusalem. It's called the Mishnah. And the Jews no longer live by the law of God of the Old Testament. They live by the Mishnah. They believe that this interpretation is God-inspired. So this is how far it went. I don't know what's happened throughout the centuries. But our teacher in Jerusalem told us that the Jews now live by the Mishnah. Oh yeah, they'll pray the Psalms and all of that, but as far as they're concerned, the law for them is it, end of story. There was nothing interior. And Christ now makes a clear distinction today in the Gospel of Mark. Everything that has anything to do with Christ is about the inner man. The law is about the external expression. There are many people who go to church today who do exactly what the Jews did. To do externally because it's the law. Because I have to do it, so therefore I go. There is no interior desire or movement towards God to love Him more, to know Him better, to be there, to meet with Him, to receive Him in the depth of my soul, to share my life with Him, my very being, my very essence with Him, to have an interior life, to have a spiritual life, to have a prayer life. Many people think simply going to church on Sundays and saying a prayer 4 meals is all they need to be a Christian or to be a Catholic. When you miss the whole point of Catholicism. The whole point of Catholicism is to take man to God and to allow the human being to receive God. That's why we come to the altar. To eat God and to receive Him into our beings. We have to have an interior life. And St. Augustine reminds us the principal seat of the soul according to Christ and certainly according to the teachings of the church and the teachings of our saints is in his mind, on which his whole life depends. According to the state of his mind, man is called clean or unclean. Therefore, what does not reach the mind cannot bring pollution to the man. If I am not a thief, I don't think like a thief. If I'm not lustful, I don't think lustful thoughts. And I told you a story where some years ago I was in a seminary and I made the mistake of raising my hand to ask a question. I learned after that not to ask questions, just leave it alone. But my teacher had said to us, we need to learn how to pray from the heart. And I said for a minute, whoa, explain that to me. Because as far as I know, this is a muscle. It beats blood. It has valves. It doesn't have a brain of its own. Because if it does, I got two brains. I got one here and I got one here. So I asked my teacher to explain that to me. What do you mean? Pray? I need you guys to sit down because that's a fire hazard back there. You can't stay in back. The fire marshal comes in, he's going to tell you to sit down. So I'm sorry about that. There's seats there if you want to go back in the TV room. There's some there. Appreciate it. Besides that, if my homily is too long, you're going to pass out anyways. No, we're getting there. So, but I asked my teacher, I said, explain that to me. Like I said, it was the last question I asked in the seminary because she said to me, she said, you know what? He said, go to the library and come back next week and give us a report on what it means to pray with the heart. And I said, oh, man, I don't have enough to do already. I don't have enough books to read. Now I got to go to the library and look this up. But it was a good thing. In the end, I enjoyed the research work that I did because it taught me something. So I went immediately. The very first place I went was into the Jewish dictionaries. to get their definition and understanding of the heart, was it the same as ours? This here. And I found it very interesting how the Jews understood the word heart, to pray with the heart, because the word heart is mentioned over 1,100 times. But the way that they understood it and the way they interpreted it, it is at the very core essence of what the human being is, created by God, in his ability to think, which the animals and plants don't do. His mind. And I realized at that moment I was absolutely right. This isn't it. This is it. As the saints tell us, God walks through the hallways of our minds. If I'm an angry human being and I'm angry, it's in my mind. And this is what Christ talks about today. Of course, the things that he gives us here almost contain every aspect and element of what is uncharitable in man. Evil thoughts. He begins right away with evil thoughts. Out of that come all the other things, the adulteries, the fornication, the murders. And murders here isn't just simply to kill somebody. Murder here is to wish revenge on another human being, to wish evil upon a person, to destroy another person through gossip or slander, to destroy their character or their goodness, or what they are as a human being created by God. Theft, to take something which isn't mine, but all of it begins up here. Covetousness, greediness, and in other words, that's what our translation has, but the original Greek has covetousness, wickedness. Wickedness here, of course, is everything and anything. Deceit, which also is up here, to deceive, to lie, and so on and so on. Lasciviousness, inclined towards lust and impurities, and so on and so on. And the Greek also mentions evil eye, and most of you may not even know what that is, but, the Jews, and also we see this in the Middle Ages, the evil eye sort of was a curse to inflict injury or bad luck, or to wish bad luck upon another human being by desire. And the evil eye actually would go to a look, or you looked at somebody in a particular way and wished bad upon them, and so on. It's not something so well known today, but it's something that certainly the Jews understood. It was also present. We see a lot of that, of course, in the Middle Ages as well. Blasphemy, of course, pride, prideful thoughts. We all struggle with them in some way or another. Foolishness, I'm foolish. Foolishness also is in the mind. So it's not about this. It's about this. It's what goes on up here. If I'm a nasty human being, it's because I have a nasty mind. If I'm an unreasonable human being, it's because I have an unreasonable mind. My heart beats blood. If I'm laying in a hospital bed waiting for a heart transplant, and all of a sudden somebody, let's say a 15-year-old young person dies in a car accident, and they give me his or her heart, am I all of a sudden going to have their thoughts? Probably not. I'm going to know there's something different, probably, because I know it subconsciously, I know it emotionally. But my personhood, what I am as a human being, stays the same. Because it's up here. God came to change the way we think. It was no longer external, which didn't change the way people thought. It was now internal, to change the interior of the human being from the inside out, something that no theology, no philosophy, or no religion on the face of the earth could ever do to the human being. To the extent that Christ gave it to us because he gives us grace to go with it. To change and become virtuous. to be kind, to think kind thoughts, to think charitable thoughts, and all the other things. This is why when we die and we stand before God, there is nothing that is hidden from God, because our entire thought processes are exposed to God. Everything is present to Him. We need to look at the way we think. That's what changes us in Christianity. We need to adopt the Christian virtues and principles in our minds. When we do that, we will change. But we are living in a time today where many people, just like the Jews, do everything simply because it's a law. Yes, the church has her rules and regulations, but the idea is that we have to have some laws. You can't go out there and drive in your car if you don't have a stoplight or a stop sign. You can't ride your bicycle if you don't have a sidewalk, if you don't have some sort of rules and regulations. How are you going to do things? They have to be there. The laws have to be there. That's just on a natural level. In order that, so there may be order in our lives. But this now pertains to the interior order of man. That the human being may have order within himself instead of disorder, which is called sin. Every sin that the human being commits brings disorder into man. Everything that he does interiorly that brings him closer to God and is virtuous brings order to his soul. Changing man from the inside. According to the state of his mind, St. Bede tells us, man is called clean or unclean. Therefore, whatever does not reach the soul or the mind cannot bring pollution to the man. If I don't think about stealing something, I'm not going to steal it. So therefore, I'm not a thief. It's what comes out of man that defiles him. This was Christianity and is Christianity from the very, very beginning, and always has been, that we are changed interiorly. That we become better inside. And therefore, when we become better here, we become better human beings in the process. And God willing, hopefully, somewhere along the way, we become more Christ-like. Having said that, I'm going to leave you with a particular prayer of St. Augustine. Now, St. Augustine dies in the year 430. He had been a man who had embraced Manichaeism, which was a heresy, declared a heresy by the church. Manichaeism, in a modern language, is the principality of dualism. We've all seen the little signs with the round circle, the black and the white. There's an equal good and there's an equal bad. And it's up to you to choose which way you want to go. Well, that's baloney. Because good is absolute. Evil is an absence of good, always. There's always an absence of good and evil. How can there be an equal principle? They can't. But that principle is still with us today. It was present in the time of St. Augustine. It was present even before that time. It's called, in a modern language, it's called the yin and yang theory. It's a heresy. But St. Augustine had embraced that idea. He had fallen into it as well. He lived with a woman, he had a child. At the age of 33, he converts to the intercession and the prayers of his mother, St. Ambrose. And he writes a work called his Confessions, and he literally writes down the process of his thoughts, of what he went through all those years. And he writes a very beautiful prayer in the middle of everything that he's writing, speaking to God. And he said, "Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. You were within me, but I was outside." Wow. It was there that I searched for you. Out there somewhere. Well, like you might think, God has a big ear, and if I say my prayers well enough, he'll bend down and he'll listen to my prayers outside of me. St. Augustine thought the same thing. Outside. It's there that I searched for you. But in my unloveliness, I plunged into the things which you have created. You were with me, but I was not with you. Created things kept me from you. In other words, everything that's outside of me kept me from you. Yet if they had not been, they would not, if you had not created them, it would not have been at all. You called, you shouted. You broke through my deafness. You flashed and you shone and you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance upon me. I drew in breath, and now I pant for you. When's the last time we went to church and we panted for God, huh? And we desired him. Instead of being here as a legalistic law. I have tasted you. Now I hunger and thirst for more. You touched my soul. And now I burn for your peace.